Well, thank you, Frank, very much for the introduction. And thank you to Samara, Rachel, and the rest of the team for putting the event together. Well, we know what's going to happen now. What I wanted to do is to share with you some ideas about how the idea for the book came about, just for a few minutes. The original motivation for the book was, as Frank made reference to, is before I joined GW, I spent some time doing work around development, journalism, global communication programs. So I remember sitting in workshops, in training workshops, in which Western journalism and Western journalists were teaching sort of the principles of the values associated with professional journalism in a variety of countries. And I kept wondering how much of all those sort of teachings and very interesting discussions in these workshops actually had a concrete impact in the newsroom. And so it made me think about sort of the encounter or the clash, if you wish, between sort of the conventional ideas of professionalism in Western journalism and in settings in which the conditions that originally made it possible professionalism are non-existent or extremely challenging. So I was thinking about this sort of issues, and eventually the project took a different direction. Basically because I thought that the book about professionalism already has been written, and I realized that that was not the case. And without that book, I couldn't basically address some of the original questions that I had. So that basically is another reminder why, while you're writing or doing research, it's good to keep your options open, because you never know where you're going to go. And the book that was missing was the book that I wanted to write. This is the book. It basically is a book that sort of reviews the ambiguity of the notion of professionalism. It provides a review of the critique and the defenses of why professionalism is a good idea for journalism. And it's a review of arguments about whether or not the traditional notion of professionalism is still possible, is still feasible within the current conditions in journalism around the world, not just in this country, in Europe, or in the global South. And that was the book that I wrote. So let me tell you what I think the book argues. I think that there are several arguments, and Geneva and Michael, please correct me if I'm wrong in reading my own book. This is a product. It's a product of a conversation I've been having with me, myself, and Silvio about what the book is about. So there are, I think, three arguments. So at least the number 3 sounds like a good way of summarizing what I think are the main arguments. The first one is that professionalism is a very useful analytical notion to understand where journalism has been and where journalism is now, no matter what the specific setting is. So it is sort of a heuristic tool, if you want to use that word, to understand journalistic practice. The second point is that we should not identify professionalism narrowly with the conventional public trustee model in journalism. What I'm putting forth here, based on the literature coming from the sociology of professions, is that what professions try to do is to basically control a given jurisdiction in society. And they do this through a variety of means. Basically, the goal of professions is to exercise full control and autonomy in determining how a given job is actually done. This is what professions strive to do. Journalism has been always a particular case, partially because of what Frank mentioned earlier, because of the opposition in many countries to credentialism as a way to differentiate journalism from non-professionals. So in some ways, what journalism always sort of represented was the unresolved tension that exists across all professions. And the tension is the following. On the one hand, being guided by the ideals of servicing the public good. On the other hand, reaffirming power, legitimacy, authority about who is sort of authorized to actually exercise or be a professional. So there's always a tension between autonomy and loyalty to the public good. That's sort of the second argument that I present in the book. And the third one is that the rise of professionalism, as I learned some time ago from Michael Schudson and from many others, that professionalism basically take place within specific historical complex junctures. And the question is, what happens when those junctures are no longer around? When things have changed dramatically in ways that it makes it difficult for professions to claim to have autonomy, control, or to have an internal consensus among practitioners about what we do. But it's also a matter not just only of internal consensus inside the profession, but also external consensus, what society expects professions to do. So what happens when these conditions that are in different points, for example, gave way to the idea of professionalism in the United States and in some parts of Europe, where those conditions are no longer possible? Is still journalism possible, or is journalism still desirable? And what I looked at sort of at the literature, at recent studies on professions, what is interesting is that they are discussing some of the same questions that we discuss in journalism, which is the difficulties for professions to exercise full autonomy. So if you look at the recent literature on medicine, law, accounting, psychology, some of these questions come up. How a profession can be autonomous when it's constrained by bureaucratic organizational concerns and expectations. How professions are positioned vis-a-vis the world of commerce and the world of politics. Questions that we keep sort of asking ourselves in journalism studies. And one of the conclusions that come out of this to me is that the modern dream aspiration of full autonomy may be impossible to achieve. The idea that professions can sort of exist completely detached from the rest of society in order to keep this sort of full control may be impossible given the current conditions in terms of politics, commerce, and bureaucratization in the contemporary world. By the way, this is sort of a concern that sociologists raised about 100 years ago, that the modern notion of full individual autonomy was not possible or even desirable, given social needs for order, for solidarity, and other goals. So the question is, should we worry about these developments, about the difficulties for the traditional notion of professionalism to exist? Is this good or bad? And there are all kinds of positions on this. On the one side, there are people who are very happy about throwing professionalism out the window in journalism because they blame the idea of professionalism for the notion of elite journalism or for detaching journalism from citizenship. And there are those who are concerned about the difficulties for professionalism, given that it's the only way in which journalism can claim some sense of autonomy and legitimacy to do the job it should be doing in a democracy. So I sort of discuss sort of the pros and the cons of these different arguments. So in summary, and to conclude, I think that, professionalism is a deceivingly complex notion because it raises a number of very interesting questions that do not have a straightforward answer. And that's what I find this notion very, very, very helpful. Can journalism exercise full control over its work? Is that desirable? Is that feasible? What will happen if journalism is divided over the notion of whether or not professionalism is the right mirror for the occupation? What if journalism is fragmented and lacks the basic consensus that any profession has? These are the questions that I that I believe that require further analysis. There is something that a Mexican writer, Alfonso Reyes, said. He said that we publish books in order to forget about them, in order to say, well, I'm done with this. It's stop the suffering, right? And my approach to this was actually very different. For this was, for me, was sort of a stepping stone book, a book that I needed to write in order to address some of the questions that I started with, which is the globalization of journalistic culture. How is it possible that specific understandings of what journalism is can travel around the world? Is that possible, or is that desirable? So that's what I think that, I wrote the book because in some ways what it provides me now is sort of further questions that, as we tend to do in academia, will require further research. Thank you very much for coming. Looking forward to the conversation.
you want us to mic? Okay. Why don't you join me in Geneva, and I'll sit on the end. Hi, I'm Al May. I guess I'm a professional journalist. It was a day, not too long ago, in the newsroom, you could get into an argument about this notion of a journalist being a professional. Journalism is not a profession, it's a craft. It's all this professional nonsense is highfalutin, elitist, detached. But yet, we now have gone for 100 years building up what we call a profession. I guess I still consider myself a professional, although a craftsman on occasion. But what I thought was interesting about Silvio's book is one of the international look at it and how the norms are different, but also this question of, is it really worth applying this notion of professionalism we've built over the last 100 years to the current situation? Is it really even worth the debate? So I hope to have, we'll have a terrific discussion here. We are joined today by two very esteemed professors, but both from very different perspectives. On the far left, Geneva Overholser is just retired. She allows me to use that term, as the director of the USC Annenberg School of Journalism after 5 years. That's a good run for a director, dean, president. That's not about right. She, before that, was a professor at my alma mater, the University of Missouri School of Journalism. And before that, she had a very distinguished career as a practitioner, including editor of the Des Moines Register, at which time she, the newspaper won the Public Service Pulitzer Prize. She was an ombudsman for the Washington Post, a syndicated columnist. She has been on many boards and directors, and I told her earlier, the one I admired the most is that she's on the board of directors for the Academy of American Poetry. I love that. I think that's more craft than profession, right? Michael Schudson is a professor at the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University. He is a renowned scholar on the sociology of news and the history of news. And I have to admit, I was early in my, I read The Power of News when I actually joined the faculty, trying to brush up on my academic side. It's very, but he's a great understander from the academy. Looking, he's a trained sociologist, trained at Harvard. Also has taught at the University of California in San Diego and the University of Chicago. Has won many honors, including he is a certified genius, courtesy of the MacArthur Foundation. You probably get tired of people mentioning that.
No, I don't.
So you don't? Good. Okay, so what I'd like to do is structure this, is have our guests make a response to Silvio's book and comments, and then for about 5 minutes, and then we'll try to open it up to discussion. And please feel free, we'll go to a Q&A, and all I would ask is, this is a terrible room, and so it's hard to see both ways because I don't have that great of alligator vision. So hold up your hand, tell us who you are, and we will move from there. So I'm going to ask first Michael to go ahead and then have Geneva.
Al, thank you. And this is a privilege for me to be here today, in part because this is such a terrific book to be commenting on and to advance my own thinking, in part so I can brag that Silvio was my PhD student. I say that in many settings as often as I can and bask in the reflected glory. Although I in this group, since you know, many of you know Silvio well, I will add that, and those of you who've had excellent PhD students will also know that this is a complete myth to suggest that I've had some influence on him. Although from your remarks this morning, I realize there is a similarity between your work and mine. A colleague who was also a teacher of Silvio's, colleague of mine at San Diego, Bennett Berger, poked his head in my office one day many years ago and said, he had read something I'd written, and he said, you have the same conclusion no matter what your book is, no matter what your topic is. Your conclusion is always, it's more complicated than you thought. And that's also Silvio's conclusion, which is not to say he got it from me. He probably chose me because he'd already come to that conclusion. A terrific doctoral student is just a gift, and Silvio certainly has been that for me. Which is not to say I don't have some questions about your book. I have two that I offer as comment, and maybe we'll be able to get to them later. One concerns trajectory, or sort of historical trajectory of professionalism in journalism, and the other you've already talked about, concerns autonomy. On trajectory, there's one sentence, page 10, that I've been reflecting on, and the sentence is, "The apogee of professional journalism is behind us." And a few sentences later, you seem to undercut that to some extent. Journalism maintains its position in society and its role as the expert arbiter of news. Later in the book, citizen journalism, interactivity, the digital challenges do not, this is quote, do not necessarily undermine professionalism. So if that's true, and I agree that that's true, I don't think professionalism has been undermined, but then what's this apogee about that happened sometime in our past, I assume 50s, 60s, 70s, somewhere around there, and inspired in part by the way you address these questions in the book, I thought, what about medicine? Would we say that the apogee of professional medicine is behind us? Sociologists of medicine have said that, and physicians have complained that, we had the respect we deserved a generation ago, not so much anymore. Now we're challenged by medical ethicists, by health food stores, by public health experts who say the future of medicine is in prevention, not in cure, by personal trainers, life coaches, WebMD, et cetera, governmental standards about informed consent, and so on. So was that moment before all of that exploded, when the family doctor was a demigod, and in general, doctors were so widely admired and respected just because they had that MD by their name. Was that some kind of a fool's paradise? Was that the apogee of professionalism, or are they better professionals now because they've been forced to, say, listen to their patients? They do have to listen to their patients in a way they didn't have to before. Is that a lesser professionalism? Is it a different professionalism? What was that apogee and apogee of? And I think the same thing with journalism. If the apogee of journalism was Walter Cronkite signing off, that's the way it is, what kind of a slogan is that? It's laughable. And isn't it better that we've grown in journalism beyond it? So was this an apogee built on sand? That's question one. Second question concerns autonomy, which Silvio argues is not an adequate model for what a profession should be aiming at. First of all, it isn't practically sensible. All professions are implicated in other aspects of society, notably in the state and in the marketplace. And second, he seems to suggest that it shouldn't be, not only isn't it practical as an ideal, it's not a very good ideal. At least it's not a satisfying by itself ideal. So he asked, do we really think journalists should be autonomous from considering national security as they go about their work, if it bears on national security? Do we really think, and I think, to me at any rate, this was a completely original question. Do we really want journalists to be autonomous from considering the fate of ordinary individuals? I think that's the phrase, considering the fate of ordinary individuals. I mean, partly I'd like you to expand on that, but my question is, since I'm inclined to agree with the critique you make of autonomy as a normative ideal, but what follows from that? Does this mean we should jettison the notion of autonomy altogether? Mm-hmm. Or if there's something worth saving in it, what would that be?
Thank you. Geneva?
Great, thanks, Al. I appreciate very much being here. It's a pleasure to have read the book. I learned a great deal from it. I want to thank Frank for having us and Samara for making it all work. And while we're bragging about PhD students, I want to say that one of my former PhD students, Nikki Escher, is here at GW, and I have now become a student of hers, and I'm very proud of the work she's doing here. You all are lucky to have her. I am delighted, Silvio, that this is a stepping stone book and that you're not practicing the advice of the Mexican sage who said we write books to get them to sort of finish off the topic, because there's a great deal in here that I wanted to know more about what you really think. So the next books I will await with eagerness. I want to make 3 or 4 very quick points. One is that you talk, of course, about the tension between commercialization and professionalization, and how can we have a capitalist press that is also operating in the public interest fundamentally. So the co-optation by capitalism question is clearly very interesting, but I think you don't go at all to the fact that we have now moved from the horrors of a co-optation by capitalism to the being felled by bankruptcy as another potential, and that to me is as an extension of the same question, but really goes right at the heart of whether or not professional journalism will survive. So. The second part that I want to say is I loved your chapter on questioning professional journalism. I know Michael Schudson and others have written about this, have thought about this so much more carefully than I have, but I was too busy being a journalist, either craft or profession, to really, as is so true, you all would agree that so few of us think about this. So reading these critiques, as I read through the Marxist critique and thought about several of the different things you wrote, this ideals of professionalism are strategic rituals used by journalists to claim legitimacy and defend themselves. And I'd say, yeah, that's sort of right. And then, of course, we have the Foucauldian critique, and you talk about how by sidelining ideas that challenge dominant knowledge, professional journalism solidifies notions of acceptability and deviance. And as a good feminist, I kind of thought, well, yeah, I always sort of thought that too. And they're very, very interesting. And once again, as so often those of us who are sort of in the academy and sort of in the practice, I very much wished that you could make these very well stated and accessible critiques available to those journalists who are still out there struggling with the question of, wait a minute, why do I feel so that I'm supposed to have this passionate, true feeling about my work, and yet it isn't fitting in the critiques made of journalism today. I mean, it's very enlightening, and professionals never read this, alas. But these are extraordinarily well done and thought-provoking, and I found so many of them compelling that I was reminded of that famous Churchill quote about, indeed it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government except those other forms that have been tried from time to time, that journalism has all of these legitimate critiques made of it. And yet, and this leads me to my third point, you know, your book is quite affirming to professional journalism in many ways. And I found myself wanting more from you about, well, here, let me read. There's a wonderful statement you make at one point about it would be more interesting to pursue the questions of how journalism is continuing to be valid and how, I'll find that at some point and read it. I wanted to know more from you about your own views among the various critiques, and also among the very real, making these questions international provides a lot more interesting light and is very important to do, and of course we Americans so seldom do. But I wanted to know more about your own views about what are the continuing strengths of journalism in these various societies, and what are the ones that you fear most, you know, if the various weaknesses prevail. So I'm not being as lucid as I want to be here. I'll find that quote, which was much more lucid. But I did find myself wanting more from you in that regard, more sort of, what do you think? You pose these remarkable questions, and then I'm sitting there going, well, yeah, what do you say, you know? I know, it's academic writing. You also are much more sanguine than I am in your kind of professional journalism. There's no strong challenge. I mean, your language varies a little bit, of course, from section to section. You're representing a lot of different points of view. I get that. But actually, one could argue that the interest of citizens in being published by mainstream news tacitly recognizes the staying power of mainstream news. And you mentioned that web statistics and other things show that the power of professional journalism continues. But, you know, nobody's paying for it. And the notion that these sources of journalism are continuing to be valued because people cite them really leaves open the question of how much people are valuing that, how much people even know that that is what they're citing. Which seems to me to go right at the heart of whether you can continue any kind of autonomy as a profession. So I found that you were more sanguine than I would have thought you'd be after reading a book about, you know, citizen journalism doesn't represent an organized assault on the citadel. And really, citizen journalism isn't the only question. I mean, we know that people are getting their sources of information from all kinds of, are finding information from all kinds of sources which wouldn't even pretend to be citizen journalists. And fewer seem to me to think that having something that is clearly a professional journalism source as part of the diet is even something they're investigating, for some of the same reasons that you've spoken here, that people think it undermines, that it doesn't contribute to diversity. And so you were more sanguine there than I would have thought. And on the final point I want to make is that it was interesting to me, and I suppose this is an extension of the second argument you cite. Don't identify the notion of professionalism narrowly, autonomy versus loyalty to the public good. But what you describe here then further in the book is that it's not the ethics that distinguish, but rather the sort of knowledge of the work, the news work, how we define news work, which is really interesting because, as you acknowledge, that isn't what I think most oh, well, the reason we're a profession, you know, is because we believe in the inverted pyramid, you know, and we believe in deadlines. And I mean, it's not quite that simplistic, but really you are saying it's not about the public interest definition. It's not about facticity and blah, blah, blah. It's about we have a certain set of rules and you don't.
Right.
Yeah. So thanks. It was very interesting.
Thank you very much.
Silvio, you want to respond? Particularly I like the apogee built on sand.
Well, I mean, several thoughts, just quick reactions. One on Michael's question, my sense that your two questions raise the question whether or not professions can be democratic, whether or not sort of the old-fashioned, more like authoritarian elitist model of professions can be broken down and open up to sort of different kinds of input. And that's what's going on in the discussion in some professions, whether or not sort of citizens' input, participation, can lead to something that seems oxymoronic, which is a democratic profession, right? And the discussion is there in journalism as well as in other professions, whether or not whether the old model, the hate of the old model is gone, and maybe we are moving towards something different, still undefined. My note of caution there is that professions tend to be conservative, tend to be reactive, tend to defend power and privilege. So the question will be when professions are more open to including different sorts of expertise and knowledge that do not fit the standard conventional models of what is legitimate knowledge in whatever profession that may be. So my sense that maybe sort of we are transitioning out that, but towards something that remains undefined, especially in journalism. And the chapter on how journalism has positioned itself vis-a-vis citizen journalism, I think that provides some insights into that kind of, because it is a situation in which sort of quote-unquote expert knowledge and lay knowledge sort of interact, and who has sort of the upper hand. That's one thought. And the question of autonomy, I think, and that goes to what Geneva mentioned, I thought at the beginning when I was writing the book that I was going to be much more critical of professions. I ended up sort of vindicating some of the value of profession in spite of the challenges of autonomy and other sort of requirements. Basically because I grew up intellectually in a notion that was very skeptical and sort of distrustful of the notion of professionalism, not just in journalism, but in general, because of the preservation of hierarchy, excluding alternative forms of knowledge, citizen participation, and eventually ended up saying, well, but some of this is good. The question is, how is that possible, and whether it's possible, some sense of autonomy. Basically to preserve something that sort of the public good model that underlies all professions is still good. There's something there that I think that needs to be vindicated. How to make it possible? In the case of journalism, that's what I don't have clear models. And what I found out is that this notion of autonomy sort of work in similar ways in private models of the media and in public broadcasting. I mean, there was sort of a shared notion that journalism as a profession should be grounded on serving the public good, serving democracy. I mean, and that seems to me as a principle, it's similar and it's still valid. The question that I don't have a straight answer is the feasibility of that, given what you said. And that's why once upon a time seemed more clear what that meant and how.
It's more complicated.
It's exactly that. Especially not only because journalism is fragmented, it seems to me, in terms of different sort of settings in which journalism is practiced, or the question of journalism. But it's also sort of societies are not what societies were 50 years ago, 60 years ago, sort of having the basic consensus that are allowed not just journalism to claim control, but sort of professions are much more contested now, and that's what the literature shows, in a reflection of that, societies are, sort of more likely to sort of conduct debates and to argue over a variety of fundamental issues that sort of are no longer there. Question is, you raise a number of great questions, but one is, if journalism is still valued, who pays for it? If there is some trust, and the question of trust varies around the world, and the American press worries about the low legitimacy of, low trust that you have in public opinion polls. The question is, that is still influential, is still widely used, but the question is who pays for that? And that is the question of sort of, I will say, the business model on the context in which journalism can exist as a profession, following some of those principles that at some point were taken for granted, at least in parts of the West, and today they are being thrown into question. Sort of the overall infrastructure that sort of supports a profession that claims autonomy and control over the conditions of work. And that is, to me, sort of what the question is. I try to approach that question, not in detail, but I say that question raises the question about how professionalism is possible. We cannot ignore sort of the overall structure in which professions exist, and that's what sort of affects the prospects for journalism to be a profession in the sociological sense, not in the conventional sense of, codes of ethics or, certain principles that all journalists should follow. So I have more comments, but I think I would like to open up.
One of the things that I kind of pose to all of you, if you've been following the debate in the Senate, they've just now passed or trying to pass a shield law for journalists to be able to protect their sources. And I've just read about it, but it was curious. Apparently the debate really was stuck on how you actually define who a journalist is. And so so apparently the solution was a relatively broad definition, as long as the definition did not apply to WikiLeaks. Okay? Literally, Schumann said that. So we've always had this debate, right? We've always had this notion of who's the legitimate journalist. But it was easy in certainly my career, in Geneva's career. You worked for a newspaper, you worked for a television station, and that's what made you a professional journalist, right? But now we don't. This definition has slipped. So I wonder if you could just kind of address this kind of definitional issue, if it was hard to do in the 1960s or 70s, it must be impossible to do today. Michael?
Yes, there's. I'm sure there are people probably on this panel, but not me in this case. There are plenty of state shield laws. They must have to define. How do they define journalists?
Largely as getting paid to do it.
Getting paid to do it.
And then it's interpreted in the courts.
Right.
That.
And that's how the Congress to join the press galleries. Yeah. You have to be employed in a publication that they have a set of rules, all old, all pre, if you will, web.
Yeah, I think about that and say, well, but that's going to exclude some people who, by my Platonic understanding, are journalists.
Right.
That is, they're gathering information to serve the public. They're one-person websites. They're not making any money. They're doing journalism. So maybe they need to be extra careful about their sources. I don't know, but it seems to me that by my understanding of what it is that journalism does and journalists do, they should be included. I don't want to have to be there in the legislative committee writing that law. I don't know.
Isn't that exactly, Silvio, though, the kind of boundaries issues that you're addressing and trying to...
Right, the question is who determines those boundaries.
Right.
If the boundaries determined, let's say, by the state, right? Or is it determined by the members of the profession that collectively agree on a set of boundaries? And in traditional professions, it goes both ways, right? But of course, in question where you have a licensing, the state traditionally gives the professions a quote-unquote monopoly to provide that service. And journalism in the West has always, been sort of skeptical about that for a variety of reasons: freedom of the press, First Amendment, and other sort of part of the tradition of the liberal model of the press. But the question is how it happens internally. If your thing, you can define it legally, but effectively that sort of doesn't capture a variety of journalisms that it does exist, and that's what journalism typically does. So I think it's the clash between the sort of different ways of defining those boundaries.
I can't imagine how they're going to resolve it. You know, when they first started talking about the federal shield law in this iteration, people said, well, it would be better to define journalism than journalist, you know, so you can sort of define the question of public interest partly. Well, a whole lot of people who are paid are writing stuff that isn't in the public interest.
Sure.
So I don't know how they're going to do it. I mean, I wish they'd passed it earlier so that they would be like the state laws and they already exist, and then you figure out, sort of fit people in.
Well, let me. Should we even want shield laws? I mean, is that turning over our autonomy to the state by the very act of seeking that kind of protection?
Well, I think we need to worry about our autonomy toward the state. I mean, this administration, much as many may admire them, has really shown a great penchant for secrecy and sniffing out anyone who leaks anything and punishing.
Right.
So it seems to me, yeah, I'm all for the shield law, however the hell they may define it.
Even though that may disturb this notion of just who a journalist is.
That's always been disturbed, as you say. I mean, it used to be we agonized, oh, well, somebody works for a weekly, so that they can be given a Pulitzer, you know.
Well, they had a great debate on the Hill when online Jake Tapper actually made a big fight on the Hill trying to get in the Daily Press gallery because he worked at the time for Slate.
That fight
and there was a tussle, and finally they let him in. But even though these are clearly the changes that are occurring, and it just makes you wonder, you know, this whole notion of, well, let's spend the time trying to define ourselves as a profession when it seems like it's a will o' the wisp. It seems...
Right.
We all agree it's more complicated than we think.
Right. One of the things that, and I particularly ask you, Michael, is that if you looked at a survey now, the polls show a steady deterioration in the American public's view of journalists. We're still ahead of congressmen. And maybe lawyers, but certainly there's still professionalism is held with great esteem, particularly a professional military all the time. It shows this kind of public esteem. It was professionalism in journalism kind of just a way to get esteem, just to get to build an image in the first place, and is there anything, and I asked Silvio too, is there anything you could really think of concrete that would change that, that would have an impact on that public perception?
I do think in the history of many professions, not just journalism, that calling yourself a profession is a bid for social status. Yes, it's just a job with a halo around it, and I think journalism has been maybe unusual in that, where in some fields, say social work, librarianship, others, they absolutely, completely across the board want that. And journalism has been ambivalent about it. Yes, we want to be professionals, but no, you know, we're just shoe leather guys. We're just out there on the street. And we're the sort of anti-profession. And I think that's part of journalism to this day. And you know, there's something very appealing about that. Not to mention true about it. So I've lost your question now. That was only a piece of it.
Is there any step, and maybe Silvio can answer that? Is there a mechanism that you see that would try to reverse that, to try to address that issue of credibility or image?
Right. Okay.
We've got ethics codes. We've done all these traditional things.
I don't think there's any golden road to that.
Is there a rut?
you do good work, and that will. This is the optimist in me. In time. People will notice in time, but but that's an act of faith there.
I think that when it's here that comparative analysis is useful, because if you look at countries in which in journalism there was never sort of a consensus big paradigm that, let's say, the major news organizations and journalists working for those organizations were expected to observe. But you always had sort of a fragmented trust, that people trust in the journalism they believe in a way that the journalism that sort of cover the issues that they were interested in from the perspective that they wanted. I mean, sort of this question of selective perception leading to the way that people trust or believe in the journalism that was, sort of that reinforced pre-existing views. And that is talks about a fragmented journalism rather than a unified journalism around common values. And some of the discussion is going on in this country, seems to me, whether or not, I mean, we are moving definitely there, which is sort of going back to sort of 19th century journalism in ways that it's more difficult to talk about a single journalism and therefore a single notion of do people trust journalism in singular? And maybe that's today sort of the wrong question to ask because of what we know about sort of offerings and how people choose news, how people read news, what people expect from news, which makes that question much more complicated.
Yeah, I think that's right. And certainly, I mean, that debate's been going on since the Hutchins Commission and long before, and it would have been a lot easier then for journalists really to come together under one unifying code. And it wasn't easy, and it didn't happen, and I think it's just as well it didn't happen, frankly, and I certainly don't think it will happen now.
Well, in fact, you've been involved very much in the professional organizations, the ASNE and all of that. They seem to have been weakened lately. They're financially struggling, and even the infrastructure that was built up around the profession seems to be deteriorated.
Well, they don't have any money. I mean, in the glorious days when 900 of us would go to the American Society of Newspaper Editors and swan around, and I mean, it was really wonderful. You could pay for anything. And people now, oh my God, at the LA Times we used to fly first class. I mean, it's just so over. Right. So it is a completely different world. And the news, but even in the strong days, ASNE couldn't get over its differences from APME to get together even there. I mean, it's a very fractious, it's a very fractious group. And it's not just the charm of that, it's that people really have very different jobs, and they serve very different communities, and they have different ideas of what the best way to serve the public interest is, and people are better able, in some ways in the old days, to get together by sector. Sports editors saw common purpose, and feature editors saw common purpose, and editors did. The ASNE was important to those of us who were editors in the day when you really had resources and you really were investing in the future, although we didn't invest in the future very well, as we've all noticed. But yeah, I don't think that's the root. I think that trying to define oneself as a professional in a collaborative, or as you said, collaborative or participatory is not the word it used to be, but it is going to be about partnerships. So what I think those of us in journalism really do need to think, what can I contribute to the partnership that the citizen journalism can't, or that the community foundation can't, or what do we all bring to the table? And then people can see, it's a little bit, as you said, you do good work and it'll be recognized. People see that you bring a skill. People see that you do bring a certain set of job expectations that actually help to produce work that's meaningful for a community. Then I think that can distinguish people. But I don't think we'll ever get together. And that day, it never came, and it certainly is past.